Hello, everyone, and welcome. Lars Bockilt here. We're just going to allow a few moments for attendees to log on. So sit tight, and in the meantime, we also have a little kind of incoming poll question for you, just to gauge some of where you're coming from around this topic. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome. It's really my pleasure to kind of host us all and moderate this exciting panel. So first of all, thank you all for joining us, and our panelists, who I'll be introducing in a moment, for being willing to participate in this exciting conversation. We've actually had over 80 folks register for this event, which is a really great turnout for this kind of focused conversation. So really pleased to have you here with us. But before we begin, in a conversation about land and resources, it's obviously particularly important that we acknowledge the land all of us are joining from. Here in Canada is the traditional territory of many nations. For myself, Michelle, and Ryan, what is now called Toronto is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, Nishnabek, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many peoples. Margaret is joining us from Treaty 20 territory and is the traditional territory of the Mississauga and the Chippewa nations. And we'd all like to offer our sincere thanks to elders past and present as stewards of these lands for the privileges to live and work on these territories. It's now my genuine pleasure to introduce the panelists. It's great to see those that have completed the poll, and it's nice to know we've got a really kind of wide mix of folks coming from space, kind of renting space or owning space or both. And I invite all the panelists to just turn on their video now as well. Wonderful. So yeah, just to introduce our great guests. So first, Michelle Francis is the communications manager of the Toronto Community Benefits Network, which organizes across community and labor to advocate for economic inclusion through community benefits and social procurement. Michelle also joins us as the former co-chair of the Community Action Planning Group in York West for over 6 years. And CAPG, as it's known, helped organize in the Jane Finch community to advocate for and negotiate with Metrolinx for a community hub and center for the arts in the Jane Finch area. Joining us as well is Ryan Collins Swartz, the co-executive director of Tapestry Community Capital, which is a nonprofit co-op that supports others in raising and managing community investment. Since 1998, they've helped raise or manage over $70 million in community investments and are really a leading service provider around community bonds for co-ops and nonprofits as well. And finally, but by no means least, is Margaret Hancock, who currently serves on the board of the Ontario Nonprofit Network and the Wellesley Institute, as well as being the vice chair of the Ontario Nonprofit Network Steering Committee, among many other appointments. Margaret joined us having formerly led Family Services Toronto from 2007 to 2019, during which time she helped navigate the organization through a major redevelopment of their existing sites in partnership with private developers to really provide high quality office and programming space as well. So we have a really great cross-section of panelists coming from both more kind of institutional backgrounds, more grassroots environments, as well as service providers. And so, really excited in the context of VCIB's work as a social purpose real estate lender to kind of host and facilitate this conversation, which we think is very timely in the context of organizations thinking through how their future post-COVID will look like, especially with respect to real estate. So I think it's really important that we take the opportunity to kind of start with the why. Why this conversation? Why now? Why is this relevant? And so I'd really like to maybe direct this first question at Margaret. Why have you seen organizations pursue the acquisition or redevelopment of spaces? What have been their primary motivations? And as you think about that, I'd also ask, why is it worth leaders actually thinking about this now? Oh, I think you're on mute, Margaret.
Thank you. I love starting with the motivation question, so I'm glad you started us off that way, Lars. And when I think about motivation, it's in the nonprofit world, we're all driven by mission and we're all driven by impact. And we are all thinking about what would be in the best interest of the people with whom and for whom we work, our clients, our participants, our community, and our staff. And I would acknowledge that each of us would be coming from this, in a specific context. So each context is going to be different. Each place is going to have particular needs and opportunities, and each initiative will be unique. But I think there are some aspects of motivation that we do share. And probably organizational resilience, I would say, is often the most powerful motivation when considering ownership of space or developing space. Of course, that has many aspects to it. It can be about program development or maximization or improvement. It can be contributing to building community that you're in and community wealth. It can also be building long-term financial sustainability for your own organization. And my story about building this space at 355 Church with Family Service Toronto illustrates some of this. So we had very poor programming space for counseling clients and program participants who were dealing with issues of violence and abuse and trauma and difficult things. And we ended up with a gorgeous purpose-built space so that people can walk in and feel energized and feel respected in that space. We wanted to build some affordable community space in the downtown core, which had really very little of that. And we managed to do that as well as a contribution back to the community. And then the financial sustainability piece. And I think for today to note that we believe real estate is an excellent investment for the long term, especially in a low interest economy. The asset appreciates, your volatility in terms of operating expenses is reduced. You're not at the mercy of rental prices with a landlord. It can be a hedge against inflation. It can reduce your operating expenses, and it can give you opportunities for social enterprises and additional revenue because you control the space and its use. And I would just say, Lars, that I think in addition to the specific motivations you might have for your organization, social purpose real estate and space for nonprofits and charities are also about equity. And they are not financial equity, but social determinants of health kind of equity. They're a way to address injustice and power imbalances. And nonprofits and charities have social purposes, which deserve spaces which are respectful of the community. We deserve to be able to build and hold community wealth, to do our work in beautiful, respectful spaces. So looking at space as an equity issue motivates us to think about our spaces with intention and energy rather than just as places to hang our hats. And I think this frame of space as an issue of justice allows us to shift and lift the conversation and envision our spaces with some greater purpose. Maybe I'll stop there.
Okay. Thanks very much, Margaret. That's a wonderful introduction. And I think that does a really good job kind of laying the landscape of these different dimensions that organizations navigate. Maybe kind of taking that as a starting point, Michelle, I'd be curious to hear from you for CAPG and the communities that you were engaging with. How did those same kind of motivations come to the fore? Were there particular ones that were most prominent? Was it kind of the same sort of mixture of all that Margaret described? What did that look like?
Yeah, yes, there were very similar reasons, absolutely, for wanting to get involved. And I'd also add that, there's personal reasons, a lot of personal reasons, because I guess I do come from the receiving end of some of those systemic issues, and put in that position, and yet myself experiencing great privilege in my life, yet I was still exposed to some of the hostilities that historically underrepresented communities are faced with. So if I could face those hostilities, I felt, what about communities who are so underrepresented and are struggling, on a day-to-day basis? How are they dealing with these struggles? So that was the reason I got involved. I'd actually, at this point, I was no longer living in Jane and Finch when I started volunteering for CAPG, but I thought, I've got to go back and see what's going on, because I'd experienced some hostility, and I thought, how do I reconcile this? So I actually went back into the community, and I found that I joined this volunteer group, and I recognized it right away that a lot of the problems were right there in that space. And how could I insert myself here and help to to walk myself through this, and to see where this could go, and how I could actually contribute to some of the systemic change that needed to happen. And it was a really great experience. And I have to give the group credit. I mean, they had already been working on this for years. It was years before I got there. They were aware of some of the available spaces there. So joining them and contributing to that work, it helped, not only, heal this issue that I was struggling with, but it also, I think, and I hope that, it helped pull in, some community members who were maybe not at that table at the time and should have been there. So I hope that kind of answers the why. I know it's a little personal, but I think that that a lot of us are in this work because of very personal reasons. And I continue because of that. So that's where I am.
Absolutely, I appreciate that, and definitely the kind of grounding of that as to kind of what motivates you as well as you think about these sometimes pretty conceptual issues, right, of space writ large, to maintain energy for that work. And Ryan, kind of centered on the same theme for you with Tapestry and the kind of organizations that are approaching you. I'd be kind of curious to know, particularly in this moment, are you seeing organizations continue to approach Tapestry around kind of community investment opportunities, despite obviously the ongoing challenges of the pandemic? And if so, what kind of motivations are kind of coming to the fore most often?
Thank you, Laris. I would say first, groups come to us because they believe that community ownership builds resilience. And there are a lot of groups that we're working with now, providing affordable housing, building sustainable food systems, providing different types of education, who really believe in allowing their community who benefits from the space to have ownership over the space. And the pandemic has really shown the power imbalances that exist when a lot of the spaces that benefit communities are controlled by groups who are outside of that community. And really looking to, as we recover from COVID, build new models of community ownership and community wealth.
Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, that's a really interesting kind of thread around that kind of twin parallel of kind of like resilience and precarity in space, and Margaret, as you well described, the fact that we can think about space and access to it and the resilience of it as a social equity issue in its own right, and that more precarious spaces will actually mean more precarious communities inherently. As we start to kind of transition to thinking more kind of forward-looking at the opportunities that present, we also just have kind of another kind of poll question to kind of prompt people around some of these ideas. So we're just asking if you've ever considered actually working under a shared roof, so to speak, with other not-for-profit partners. So just cue that up. Said, there we are. See what kind of comes back in. Got some folks already sharing their space. Some that wouldn't work for only internally, okay. So you've kind of had conversations internally, but not yet doing it with others. That's interesting. Okay, so so far, a fair amount actually of that either actively being done, actively in discussion, or kind of actively being thought about. Interesting. That's exciting. So yeah, thinking forward, just kind of transitioning a little bit to thinking about opportunities. It's interesting. We talked about the motivations as to why. Curious to ask the panelists. Have you kind of seen actually new opportunities created when nonprofits do own their space? And if so, kind of like, what does that more kind of tangibly look like? One of those opportunities most likely? What makes that most likely? And maybe to start, we'll kind of put that to Michelle. Curious, what kind of opportunities you saw in the development of the Jane Finch Hub?
So, okay, we're still, we're not quite developing it yet. We now have a commitment from from Metrolinx to transfer the land to the city, and that's currently in process. It's pretty much assured. There has been an agreement in principle for the city, the communities organizing committee, so the Jane Finch Community Center and Center for the Arts Organizing Committee, and a local agency to participate in a joint project on the land. So that's happening. But in terms of opportunities, there are multiple opportunities, and one of the big reasons for that is because there are very few spaces in the community right now where they are run by the community, or the community is the steward of those spaces right now. I think actually, and it's funny because it's actually under construction right now. There's the public library. There's a few community centers, small community centers, but then most of the other spaces are actually spaces that belong to other organizations. So the community needs to go through those organizations to use them. There is no dedicated space for the Jane Finch community, for example, to have its own pool with a Red Cross program running out of it. That does not exist in the Jane Finch community. So there's opportunities for that. There's opportunities for social enterprise to be in this space. There would certainly be the opportunity for, some agencies to be in the space. There's definitely, the talk of a community kitchen would be, one area where people would love to see, the space utilized. And another important factor that came up over and over again was a place for mental health, and a place for the community to go to address mental health issues. So certainly lots of opportunities, not to mention the fact that this is coming out of an infrastructure project that is designed to improve transit in the community. The Jane Finch neighborhood, if you are not aware of it, the Finch bus and the Jane bus, I think, are the second and third busiest bus routes in the city. So of course they need improvements. And I think, as we've learned, the moment you improve transit, more people start to use it. So there's another opportunity to benefit the environment itself, right? If more people are on public transit. So yeah.
And I guess as the conversation began around the idea that this could be, as you're describing, kind of community owned and community controlled space, like curious if that was more generative as a kind of a conversation for the community members that you were engaging. Like, the kind of ideas you mentioned, commercial kitchens, et cetera, like, was that something that the kind of communities were kind of coming up with themselves? Like, where did that kind of come from?
Yes, there was a feasibility study done. More than 800 people in the community. I think it's getting close to 1,000 because it's still kind of out there running. And you know what? I mean, at the time when it was 700, it was like, you know, 90% of the people asked for a pool, you know, 50% of the people were interested in the community kitchen, like 80% of them were asking about mental health, you know, probably like 50%, like, and I'm off, these aren't exact numbers, but it was astonishing, you know, the number of people that asked for these things. So yes, it's definitely something that the community has asked for. And in terms of ownership, the ownership question, you know, has really been talked about, that they wanted to actually own this. And I have witnessed, something of an evolution there, because let's be realistic, these spaces are extremely expensive to build. And, the fact that you're going to get an angel investor coming forward and, giving you $50 million or whatever it takes to build a pool and a community kitchen and social enterprise space, that remains out there. So I see the question of ownership sort of moving more towards this question of stewardship, and I think that that's a really great evolution of what we've seen, with the community coming together and dialoguing and getting feedback from all the stakeholders, and knowing that if they want to generate this space that everybody in the community is going to benefit from, then that stewardship question, or the stewardship title is perhaps even better than ownership in some ways.
It's a really kind of fascinating example where it's hard to imagine, to your point, with existing spaces being either owned outside of the community or already having kind of a dedicated purpose. The ability to kind of imagine some of those purpose-built uses, right, that really kind of emerge from community as well. So it's an interesting story of not knowing what would probably come of that community engagement until that process was really led. Maybe Ryan, transitioning the same kind of question to you. Curious what kind of opportunities have kind of come to the fore when you've engaged with your partners and clients. What kind of ideas are they focused on? Are there other opportunities that it would be interesting to share with the audience that people come up with?
I think when looking back on the past 10 years and the projects that we've been involved with, we can see that ownership of space can be really a strong foundation and a launch pad for growth and for the future. It's a little bit of the injustices of the financial system, but to acquire a space, you typically need to borrow money. But it's very difficult to borrow money if you don't own a space or have assets. So we do see organizations become in a much stronger financial position once they own their first asset. And often the first asset is the hardest to own, which is where community bonds can come in as a financial tool. And then once you own a space, it's easier to have a line of credit, perhaps expand to a second space. But more than anything, we see groups be able to invest and really have a multi-generational view of a location, rather than being unsure if they can invest in a certain location if they might have to move in the next few years. Something that really struck me this past summer when we were preparing our latest community bond campaign for the Center for Social Innovation, which is one of the first organizations that we supported the community bond campaign back in 2010, is that when they bought their first building in 2010 until now, they grew from $400,000 in annual revenue to just over $9 million in annual revenue, and from one location to 4 locations. And as a co-working space that relies on a lot of in-person revenue, owning their space, I think, gave them a lot of resilience over the pandemic to set up a community rent pool and really not have to evict any of their tenants, and it's remained a community space. So I do believe there is something to it of being able to unlock some long-term possibilities.
That's a really kind of fascinating point, and certainly even in our own experiences.
Is Lars frozen, or is it just me?
Oh,
okay.
We've lost our leader. Can we talk among ourselves while we wait for Lars? Questions from the audience, maybe?
Oh, you lost me. The joys of working from home, everyone. I think our audience is back as well. Great. Apologies for that, and we'll carry on. What I was commenting is just the ability to build up assets on the balance sheet in a context where that can be really difficult. And in some cases, particularly if it's cash assets that would otherwise have demands in programming and things like that, it might not be as favorably looked upon by funders either. Certainly we've seen organizations be able to borrow against their buildings in the context of the pandemic to provide some of that long-term resilience. And so it's interesting, Ryan, to your point, to kind of hold that long-term view, right, and really kind of think forward. Margaret, yeah, curious to hear from you as well. Like, you kind of touched on in the first question a variety of opportunities that obviously manifested with the redevelopment at Church Street. I know you've also had lots of other experiences with other organizations as well with respect to acquiring spaces. So curious to kind of pass that over to you around what kind of opportunities you've also seen emerge.
Are you thinking emerge like very recently, Lars, specifically, or over time?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think what has that ownership of space, I guess, meant for organizations that you've worked with? Okay.
Well, one example is Oxfam Canada, who were based in Toronto on Carlton Street, actually. And when I was there, I sold that lovely Victorian home and we bought a storefront on Bloor Street because we had a social enterprise called Bridgehead, which is the coffee company, Bridgehead Trading. It all supported farmers and growers in the South and free trade, fair trade coffee, etc. And so we had the opportunity to partner with Bridgehead and build them a storefront and make that possible in a coherent and collaborative way. And that was one thing that we did there that I really liked a lot. And it also put us on the street and in the community in a way that enabled Oxfam to get more, I think, street presence and just general knowledge from people about it. I would say the same thing for the Wellesley Institute, which has its roots in the Wellesley Sherburne neighborhood in the hospital that's been sold, and has recently purchased property at on Gerrard Street and will return back to the community once that, from which it grew, once that property is renovated. And it will also become more of a community resource than where the Wellesley is now, which is in rented space in a sort of swishy area. It doesn't speak to the values of the organization. So I think you can use spaces to express your values, really, in where you locate yourself and how you locate yourself and how you relate to the community, and provide access in a variety of ways with the wealth that you have. I think that it and social enterprise, as people have mentioned, it's only good. There are endless possibilities when you do that. I think we also, at Family Service Toronto, purchased a piece of the building at 128 Sterling Road, which is near the Museum of Contemporary Art. You may know that the Drake is there, etc. And that's a different model of ownership as well, where we purchased a piece of the ownership of the whole building and live there as tenants and pay rent. And then we get a return on our investment at every year, at the end of the year. So it's another dimension of ownership that I quite like.
Mm-hmm. And that's kind of fascinating to talk about some of those other dimensions. So, like, the ability to be close to the communities in which you serve, to change your kind of perception within a community, to kind of anchor locally. That's really fascinating. So this has been a really interesting conversation so far about what motivates people. Some of obviously the kind of highlights that people have seen through this work. Obviously, this work isn't without its challenges as well, and so just as we kind of transition to thinking about some of the risks, we have another audience poll question. In this case, we're really asking people about their kind of top concern when you think about real estate. So as you think about real estate, what is your top concern? And we'll just cue that up momentarily. So I think that should be live for people. No responses yet. Oh, there we go. Losing access due to cost increases, actually having the cash resources to acquire, the cost of servicing debt, absolutely. Well, that seems to be the winner so far. The winner's the wrong way to put that, but yeah. Okay, yeah, so far it seems like, primarily, let's call them kind of mostly financially related concerns about the resources needed to acquire space, and then the costs associated with servicing debt. Those are the kind of main two concerns that folks in the audience have. And so, with that kind of context, interested to hear from the panelists around your own experiences and the kind of risks that are created for organizations when they are seeking to own their own space. And one way perhaps to frame that is, what kind of conditions do you think really should be in place for an organization to pursue this? Any kind of minimum requirements or sort of called like stop signs you'd really kind of flag for people? Maybe, Ryan, we can start that with you. I know that Tapestry certainly does a lot of that kind of due diligence with partners and in partnership with your clients.
Thanks, Larry. A great example is the story of Sketchworking Arts, which recently, as of this spring, has acquired their space, supported with community bonds, a mortgage, and also some fundraising. And to go back about 2.5 years ago, they had this very real situation where they are an arts charity. They've been around for 25 years, providing incredible arts programming to young people experiencing homelessness. And the core of how they made their impact was a studio space where they had all kinds of different programs, from a commercial kitchen to a recording studio. In their history, they had bounced around to many different places, but found a permanent home in the past 5 years in the Artscape Young Place building. And within the next few years, a lot of their rent subsidies were going to end. So they had to look at, what is the risk of us being priced out of our current location? And to them, that risk outweighed any of the financial risk. So we worked with them to assess the financial plan for how they were going to afford this $4 million purchase this year, but also be able to service the debt. So that looked like finding out how to kind of make up that pizza or puzzle of the 4 million, which looked like about 1.5 million in community bonds, another 1.5 million in fundraising, and another million or so in a mortgage. And that's what they've done for their project home. So for them, they're able now to have security over their space, an incredible team. You can go to their website, sketch.ca/projecthome, to learn more. And I would say perhaps it starts in terms of conditions, about having clarity on their space. For them, it was really important that they knew this is the space for us. There's never going to be another space like it. It's what our staff want. It's what our community wants. And from that place, they're in a strong position to go forward and try to find a way to make it work. Beyond that, I would say having a really strong leadership of the organization, supportive board, helpful volunteers and advisors, and perhaps last, like at least a little bit of clarity about their financial future and what that looks like.
Interesting. And so you kind of hear you about that starting point about vision and buy-in, and to your point, that's an interesting reframing actually, to kind of suggest there's also there are risks to inaction as well, right? There's kind of inherently risks to the status quo. But hearing you about that need for vision and buy-in, management stability, I kind of heard from you clarity on some of the kind of medium to longer term. Curious on that same kind of thread, maybe to Margaret. You've obviously had a range of experiences with this kind of topic of social purpose real estate. Curious what kind of like essential conditions as well you would kind of really highlight for folks as needing to be in place, or the main ways that risks can be mitigated.
I can't agree with Ryan more about the need for clarity on the vision. I think when organizations start down this road, and you could see it from the poll that you had before about people are focused on finances, and that's often what drives them, and it's often what keeps people stuck. I think they think, oh my goodness, these are big numbers. We've never had that before. How are we ever going to get there? And without first discerning your vision and getting that really clarified with your board and your staff group and your community, probably, you'll just stay stuck. And so I think really that is I can't underscore that enough. And I've worked with a few boards on this, wanting to help them just back up a bit. Don't worry about that other thing. It will come, build it and it will come, I think often happens. And when you have good, clear vision, it becomes magnetic in a way. You attract people and organizations like Tapestry Capital, like the community benefits folks, to your project. And then guess what? It starts to really cook. So I would just leave it at that, Lars, that I think the vision clarity is a key condition.
That's a really fair point. And I like, actually, it's probably rare that you'll hear a banker say, I actually like the idea of like backburnering the finance conversation to a degree, because it's so true. In our more humble moments, I joke that we're pretty much just fancy plumbers at a bank. We're really just like directing kind of flows to different places, right? And that's fundamentally what it's about, though, is enabling strong, coherent, robust visions. Absolutely. I'm curious then, Michelle, from your experience, were there kind of particular risks that kind of the community was concerned about, or perhaps thinking about the obviously kind of critical negotiations that you had with partners, were there kind of particular risks that they were most kind of attuned to, and that you then had to think through as a community group how to kind of demonstrate and mitigate against?
Absolutely. And I agree 100% with both Margaret and Lars here, like in terms of having that mission, having that, that vision, understanding, what your goals are. The community was there already. As I mentioned, they were watching that land. They actually were aware of it. And I think if we, from the beginning, had not realized that was our land, at one point in the history of that land, it did belong to the city. And, if it wasn't going to a private developer, which it wasn't, right? Metrolinx was using it to build their maintenance storage facility, then it belonged in our hands, right? It was a set aside to be something that was going to be used for the community. So I think the fact that that we stood our ground in terms of what we wanted to see happening on that land, I think that was so critical and so important, and that we never gave up. We went to every level of government. We went back to the community over and over again. And the Toronto, thanks Margaret for mentioning the Toronto Community Benefits Network, where I am now. We partnered with people who could bring expertise into the conversation. And, if it wasn't for the Toronto Community Benefits Network, we would never have been able to present our case to Metrolinx, this arm's length branch of the provincial government, as to why we needed that space and why we were asking them to shrink the footprint of the maintenance storage facility so that the community could have access to that 32-meter setback in the heart of the Jane Finch neighborhood, in downtown Jane Finch. You know, they were threatening to put a heavy industrial complex right there, right up to the sidewalk. So, you know, now, you know, we essentially have that 32-meter setback, fully 250 meters across from York Gate to North Finch Drive. It's a massive piece of land. And yeah, I think all of those things were really important. That commitment from the community was really important. And there was a risk. I think, you know, if we had lost sight of that vision, if we had stopped doing that work, if we had not been able to pull in those stakeholders, if we had not presented to the 3 project companies that were bidding on building the MSF, 2 of the 3 included the setback in their proposal. So, you know, like clearly, you know, that 3rd that didn't include it was struck. So it was between the 2 that included it, and thank goodness they won.
That's fascinating. I mean, that's I think a really telling story of exactly, Margaret, what you described as well, which is, you know, a vision kind of being fairly magnetic and influencing and creating allies in other parties, right? Like it probably would have been unlikely, or almost surely unlikely, right, that you would have seen that kind of clear community benefit so built into these large infrastructure proposals without the kind of influence building, right, that a group like CAPG and the Community Benefits Network undertook. But at the same time, it's almost like you were able to get to a point in which that was seen almost as the default option, right? Two of the 3 bids kind of included that in one of the 3 bids, didn't it? It was no longer like, you know, a dark horse idea. It was actually seen as kind of the presumption, right, that of course there needed to be some kind of community benefit in this kind of large scale project. Just curious to kind of build on that, Michelle, just as a follow-up question to you, you know, as you've thought then about, I guess, applying those lessons learned within the broader kind of community benefits space and the work of the Community Benefits Network, like how have you kind of thought about kind of unusual allies, or are there kind of other kind of ways that you've thought about kind of like building visions with community?
Oh, well, we are a network. So, you know, we have 120 members and, you know, like there are, but maybe like, I don't know, 60% are agencies. You know, we're also a labor movement. We are born of the labor movement. Half of our board is labor. So, and this is a very big, important part of that work is that the stimulus, when they talk about stimulus for a downturn in the economy, it's always construction. So, you know, at the very heart of it, we are in, you know, a strong sense, a construction organization. And apprenticeships are a big part of that effort to make sure that underrepresented groups are brought in to construction projects so that we all feel the benefits of those stimulus packages, right? You know, so it's not just going to people who actually live outside of the city. It's actually now being being impacted and being felt by people who live in those communities where they are represented in labor unions, which, you know, and that's one of the reasons that we are this child of the labor movement, is the labor unions themselves know that they have an issue with here. It's back to your question about, or your comment about equity, Margaret. You know, this is areas where we need to do work on equity. So, you know, and then in terms of like some of the other projects that are happening in the city, these projects are happening everywhere, right? The real estate values in Toronto are, as we all know, we're here at this presentation because of this crazy market in Toronto. So, this is like, this question is never going to go away, it seems like, until who knows what happens to the market, because we're always going to need amenity spaces for communities. We're always going to need affordable housing. We're always going to need good transit, you know, and these things are, we're told, are not profitable. So, you know, and they don't really fit into that, you know, that investment mold, right? It's not the places where you see investments. So that work needs to continue happening. Communities need to continue demanding, you know, that those spaces are available for them. As long as there are essential workers in our city, as long as there are people making minimum wage in our city, and there will you know, there's probably going to be that for a long, long time until the minimum wage, you know, becomes more in line with the living wage. We're always going to need those things. So that work always has to be done. I don't know if I answered your question there, Lars, but
well, you did. You brought up actually a really interesting point to the kind of idea of why this moment as well. Like, you know, it's interesting to imagine, you know, a kind of a stimulus case as well, right, to government funders as well, about the opportunity to invest in community assets as having these kind of multiple benefits. I do see some questions into the chat, and I'd encourage folks to continue posting some there. We're going to transition to Q&A after a final question, but just as we do, like to, you know, ask folks about the kind of needs they actually have in their spaces today. So, you know, what best describes the kind of space needs you actually have? We'll just cue that up. Should be going live momentarily. Okay. So what best describes the kind of space needs you have? Is it more office, general purpose programming? Okay, mixed office use and programming, just offices, some specialized spaces, some more general purpose. Indoor and outdoor space, okay, interesting. Okay, so it looks like, you know, the vast majority of folks between kind of office through to kind of mixed use office and programming. But in general, you know, not as much actually kind of highly specialized space or indoor and outdoor space. And so, you know, the ability probably to use more general spaces. You know, we're really interested then in thinking about how do we equip members of the audience and thinking forward around really kind of key factors for success. And so, you know, looking to the panel, reflecting on your own experiences, what are some kind of key success factors? We've talked already at some length about the value of clarity and vision, but if you were advising, what would you suggest as a key first step? And maybe, Margaret, I can put that to you first.
Mm-hmm, sure. So the vision is a piece, and I would say along with the vision, you need a champion. So you need someone who truly believes in that and is going to see it through. Because there will be ups and downs, there will be changes, there will be setbacks, and you need to be able to hang on to that vision and just really have the belief in yourself as a leader that you will make your way through this situation. I also think a key success factor relates to this, that you have to know that it's delayed gratification. It takes a long time for these things to come to fruition, whether you're building something new or you're buying and renovating or whatever. It's likely going to take years, and including from the vision state forward, you know, with the FST project, where we ended up with a 33-story building with FST owning the podium and the special spaces within that, it took 10 years from the initial discussions with ideas people and then with the board and staff and community through the planning processes, the city processes, etc., finding our developer to work with, and then the actual building of it took 10 years. And in that time, things change, right? Some of your vision will change, and you just need to have confidence that you can adapt and roll and think your way through it. So I would say that. And alongside that, there's the governance and decision-making piece with a nonprofit board of directors or board of directors of a charity that's different than when you're just running your own show. And it's just about good governance. It's about, as a leader, starting at the beginning to bring people into your conversation, have open conversations, discuss the risks, because that is the purview of the board to be very concerned about that, work through their questions, work through your responses and answers, and be diligent about that. But alongside that, I would say, make sure that you carve out a decision for the executive director with enough autonomy so that they have broad parameters within which to act. Because on projects like these, you can't be going back to the board or even your senior team all the time to be asking about details. You won't get through the city process, you won't get through the construction process, etc. Financial, all of those things. You need room to act, but in a transparent and agreed upon way. And then I would just say, finally, you just need great partners, and I believe they're out there. Lots of people say, nice things about developers, etc. There are marvelous people out there doing this work. Architects, consultants about these things who care deeply about nonprofits and builders and financial people, as we can see from folks here with us today. So that would be my contribution, Lars.
Thanks very much, Margaret. And yeah, maybe shifting to Michelle, I'm curious on the own kind of success factors that you saw. If you were kind of providing a position of advice, or if you think about projects that the Community Benefits Network is now kind of partnered and engaged with, what are the kind of key success factors that you're looking for?
Yes, so I think one of the big things was, recognizing your power as a community. Communities have so much power, and I don't think that a lot of them are aware of, especially, these groups that the Toronto Community Benefits Network advocates for, those underrepresented groups. They are not aware that, like 10% is just showing up. And I know it's hard because, a lot of these communities, they're busy, right? They've got young children, they might have more than one job. It's a struggle, but I think once they can recognize their power and, realize, what they can do when, when they commit to a project and, when they, draw that line in the sand and say they're going to make it happen, I think things can really happen. Absolutely what Margaret said about the partners, I 100% agree with. And I just wanted to make a mention too, and this is something that we've actually been able to leverage the Toronto Community Benefits Network in terms of the types of members that we have, grassroots members, and those grassroots organizations that are out there. I find that they can be tremendously powerful in, in so many different ways. So while, yes, I realize that, to get volunteers, it is a challenge. And as I just mentioned, people are working 2 jobs and having families and kids, and it's complicated and it's a struggle. But there is a certain amount of luxury involved with not being beholden to a funder when you're out there advocating for yourself. And then finally, I wanted to mention this earlier, but it's that not listening to that constant foghorn of austerity that's been blasted at us since the 1980s, because we have witnessed this pulling apart of society where, we're seeing income equality growing, at, it's an obscene rate. So, what, we have to stop listening to that message, and we have to start demanding our due, as the market, as those consumers who are, essentially, the reason that that capital flows. We are the market, and as such, we, are entitled to something for that. So, I think maybe that's where I'll leave it.
It's a really kind of interesting framing as well, like that not accepting too much of a given narrative. And I think we've kind of heard that as an interesting thread throughout the conversation of kind of holding space for vision and imagination and kind of like holding a positive frame as well in the context of what are really long-term challenges to Margaret's point, and longer term kind of projects as well. Just to wrap up this question, Ryan, briefly curious if there's any additional kind of strong success factors that you'd call out from your own experience.
I would say in a lot of cases, actually, having a nice property owner that you're working with, and it is surprising, some of them do exist. So taking your really strong vision and sitting down with the property owner and explaining what you'd like, how you'd like to transform the space or steward the space. not going to work in every scenario. And I would also say finding allies, so having a really strong champion, but also building allies in your organization. There were some questions in the chat about like expertise, and I would say adding someone to your board of directors who has experience working in real estate, and this isn't like a big unknown, scary discussion. And perhaps the last thing would just be around like activism and advocacy, and recognizing that that's behind a lot of how our cities transform and a lot of the great work that Michelle has done, and like being able to secure the property from Metrolinx, or seeing the great work that Black Urbanism TO has done to have Little Jamaica recognized as a heritage community. So all of these little changes and recognizing our collective strength as a sector can make that possible.
Thanks very much, Ryan. We do have a couple questions in the chat and about 5 minutes left in the planned session. So, one kind of comment was just that managing commercial real estate can be complex, whether that's financially, operationally. And so thinking about kind of where you also find the expertise to manage that effectively. Curious, maybe just kind of popcorn style, if anyone wants to take that. Where do you find the relevant expertise to manage these properties?
Good partners. Yeah, I don't think on our group, CapG or TCBN, we necessarily had that expertise. So we'd have to trust good partners.
I understand the question. I have found, as being the sort of manager role person for a number of buildings, that a lot of people who are really good managers can grow those skills. So lots of people who maybe are your accountants, or you're already your facility manager or something. There can be a bit of a team approach, but lots of people like doing that. And it's not really all that mysterious. You do have to dedicate resources to managing your building for sure. But I'm not sure that you need to worry too much about complex expertise for the kinds of structures that I imagine we're talking about.
And that's fair too, right? That we shouldn't be overly intimidated as well by some of the realities of this work. And I like the comment as well from Ryan that in some cases some of that can also come just through unusual, unexpected allies as well. Like have a conversation with your landlord. You never know, right? Have a conversation, as you were saying, with developer partners, because there are good ones out there as well. So another question we have that came in anonymously. Under what circumstances would you actually recommend that a charity sell its existing space and move into more of a leasing arrangement? Are there kind of circumstances in which that would make sense to you?
Well, sometimes charities do want to free up some money. Maybe they have a time window or horizon. Maybe they want in 10 years to wind down their charity. Maybe they want to make some extraordinary contributions to a certain project or an initiative. Like I can see that happens sometimes. It may be also that I don't think in this current economic situation, Lars, but sometimes people want to change from having an investment that's not liquid in real estate into something that's more liquid. Maybe for a period of time, they have a leasing arrangement that isn't overly punitive and can use the freed up dollars to do other things. But to be really, really honest with you, I wouldn't want to go in that direction myself. I would say to folks, go to the direction of buying an asset and then hang on to it. It will appreciate. You can use it. You can leverage it to do other things.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I think I'd build on that a little bit from our own experience, where we've seen this actually occur a lot lately with faith communities as well, where churches are starting to downsize and properties sell. And fundamentally, we'd say if a space is absolutely not serving you anymore, there could be an opportunity to try to take kind of equity out of that space and buy a better one that would serve you. But I think given the conversation we've had about the benefits of community-based assets, I'd also kind of challenge the questioner as well to think about the opportunity to say, is there a way that even if we are disposing of that asset, that we can do so in a mission-aligned way? Is there another partner who would also kind of steward that for community that might be interested in this space that no longer serves us? We're just heading into the end of our time, and right as we do, we kind of want to know how this went for folks. And so we just have an audience question, our final poll, to ask you, are you more or less optimistic coming out of this session? So just post that for folks. Before we lose people. There we go. So just as people are wrapping up the session, just ask you how you're feeling. About the same, more? Oh, they're fighting out. No one's feeling less. So far, no one is less. So that is not, feel free to answer that if you were going to, but so far no one is less. And about the same. So some are more, about a quarter more. Everyone else is about the same. But hopefully we've given you some good things to think about, a little bit of hopefulness and shape around what this looks like as you're navigating this for your future. And so with that, I'd really want to first thank our panelists for their time, expertise, and wisdom. It's a lot here. And then as well, thank our audience for obviously taking the time to share this.